Speaking of yellow, my son loves yellow. Borussia Dortmund. That was a massive win today over Gladbach. And when the dust settles, they're now on 45 points. It's 4 points to fourth place Leipzig. Everyone ahead of them dropped points. I do think it's still a big swing, but European football is now, I think, very much possible for Dortmund and maybe even Champions League football. They could get there with less than 60 points, which is what usually it takes to get into Champions League. The Bundesliga this year, I thought a little bit about that today. I think last year you could have had make an argument that from the quality perspective, it was perhaps one of the best leagues in Europe, maybe the best, together with Italy. This year, it really wasn't. I think there was a lot of poor football being played from top to bottom, and I include the two top teams as well. It just felt very mediocre. And not very innovative. We had a lot of innovation last year. I felt there was a lot of really great moments that were provided in all the competitions, including the Pokal, right? And this year just wasn't that, which gets us back to Dortmund, who I thought were excellent today. It was a great match. Niko Kovac is slowly but truly steadying the ship there. And with all that said, with one of the most awful seasons this club will have ever played, they could still somehow sneak into Europe and maybe even the Champions League. And I think that just sums up the picture of the Bundesliga as a whole, Stefan. I don't know. I'm going to be kind of glad when the season is over and behind us, and we can look forward to maybe next year when clubs come up with better plans and ideas, because this year was a little bit blah.
Yeah, it was a little bit blah. We've had, I've been really tempted to kind of write something on how many teams have just dropped so many points
Yeah.
in 2025, especially in that kind of mid-table range where you're just really struggling to see anyone put together any form of consistency. Werder Bremen, by the way, the surprise package of the weekend, where I actually missed their game, but I logged on in time to check the score. They finished this weekend at 4 points off top four, by the way, which honestly just sums up this season perfectly
Even
well.
on points of Dortmund.
Even on points with Dortmund. Fair play to Bremen. We don't have a chance to talk about them today, but I just want to give them a shout out because they've
Yeah.
had a roller coaster season.
Your guy,
Um,
Oliver Burke, there is
my
a
guy Oliver Burke,
resurrection. A
my guy
resurrection.
Mr. Empty Hard Drive, as Ralph Hasenhüttl would say. He's laughing. Who's laughing now, Ralph? As he struggles with Wolfsburg.
As he might
Um,
get sacked, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Which we talked about in the previous show. If you missed that, so go back and listen there. Um, yeah, we've been kind of joking about this for much this season, haven't we? That despite their clear problems, despite the fact that both have sacked their head coaches, despite the fact that both have got key players who've either been injured or just completely out of form, Leipzig and both Dortmund have somehow managed to always cling on to the concept of European football. Leipzig more so than Dortmund. I think Leipzig have more or less stayed in the top four, the top six for the entire season. Dortmund are kind of clawing their way back there over the last kind of couple of weeks. Um, and yeah, it's undoubtedly been like a season where that kind of mash of mid-table clubs have just kind of formed this crazy Royal Rumble where everyone's just taking points off everyone. It makes it entirely unpredictable, so there's definitely that going for it.
Yeah.
Um, and it's fun, it's entertaining. As you say, we actually we touched on this actually in the previous show, and we talked about the Bundesliga teams and their performances in Europe this year, and that mid-table is littered with teams who obviously have had to contend with European football this season, whether that be obviously Leipzig are there, Frankfurt who dropped points again this weekend after a European game. They look very flat. I think you took in that game. Leipzig, of course, has been all over the place and they've had to contend with Champions League football. Dortmund, although Dortmund seem to have taken it in their stride in the last kind of couple of months, to be fair to them. But of course, Stuttgart are the most likely example of that. Heidenheim as well. And we'll come on to talk about Stuttgart in a little while. But I thought this was a really interesting game because I actually thought Gladbach actually gave a good account of themselves over the course of the game. The penalty was maybe a little bit fortuitous. I don't think it was a bad call by any means, but it kind of came out in the middle of nowhere, maybe, and it kind of maybe galvanized Gladbach into getting back into the game after they obviously went. They went to their lead, or Dortmund's lead went up to 2 goals. And in the second half, it felt like a game where I feel like if it had gone on for another 10 minutes, Gladbach probably would have nabbed an equaliser, if that makes sense. But in the same sense, like Dortmund deserve a huge amount of credit for the manner in which they held on. They managed to grind out a result, which is something that they certainly haven't done this season. Usually away from home, but they have had some big upsets at home as well. Like we like to think of Dortmund as being this team who are still pretty resilient for their own fans, but they have lost a lot of points, and even lost big games at the Westfalenstadion. So the idea of dropping points to Gladbach was by no means out of the picture. But having said all that, and I guess perhaps contradictory in a contradictory manner, I was still somewhat impressed with Dortmund in general. I thought they looked very dynamic, especially in attack. I loved the way that Jan Kutu and Svensson were kind of bombing forward as these wing backs. I thought Anton in the middle of the park the middle of the fence did really well. Benzibaini, I was chatting to one of our Dortmund subscribers and saying he looks so much better in that kind of left centre back role. I know he gave away an own goal in that role just a few days ago, but that own goal against Barcelona is probably the only thing he did wrong in that match. I thought he did very well in that game. He did very well in this game as well. That midfield of Gross and Mecha does really well in the middle park as well. Then, of course, when Chukwuemeka came on for Maximilian Bayer in the first half, I thought he did a great job of kind of transforming things as well. I kind of said it full time that it felt like a game in which, yeah, okay, Dortmund just about get over the line. It's maybe not the most comprehensive win of the season, but I think if I was a Dortmund fan, I'd probably be really impressed, or not impressed, but I'd be taking hope and comfort from the fact that it seems like Kovac kind of knows what he's doing now, in the sense that he knows what players to rely on. He knows his kind of preferred starting 11, and the team all feel like they're kind of clicking into gear. There's definitely still issues there. Niklas Sula's still not a good enough player to be playing centre back there. Benzibaini maybe isn't either. Kutu's obviously not the finished article by any means. Kobel's still very ropey. He almost gave away a goal in the first half when he basically got caught in possession. He just seems so lackadaisical these days. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. For the most part, I was impressed with this team selection Kovac did. And we've talked about this season, that he's kind of, sometimes he's picked what looks like his best 11, then he'll change things. And I guess he has that prerogative to kind of experiment and see what players he can rely on, which ones he can't. But I was actually quite encouraged by the fact that, having dropped Brandt to the bench and then lost Emre Can to suspension in the Barcelona game and things working really well, he didn't revert back to bringing them back in from any sense of pressure or fan pressure or whatever, or because they're perceived to be big names in that squad. Stuck with the players that, for the most part, they did really well against Barcelona. And again, I thought they did really well in this game against the Gladbach team, by the way, who have actually been really impressive away from home this season. So, this isn't your typical Gladbach side who just kind of crumble when they play Dortmund. It's a team who have done very well this season. So, or at least in the second half of the season, that is away from home. So, yeah, I guess to boil that all down to a coherent message rather than just ranting for 10 minutes, I guess I would say they did well to beat a good Gladbach team, but even more impressively, I'm glad to see that Kovac seems to know what players he can trust and which players he wants to rely on going forward.
Yeah, I thought the lineup looked really good, right? Svensson once again looks like a really good signing. He looks like he could have the same kind of impact than Riasson had for them. Just a really hard-working young player with lots of upside. He fits in this team and the culture, I think, really well. I thought Felix Nemtscher had one of his better games. This was one of the moments where you kind of realize, okay, this is why he was brought in. And the hope that they had, we had Matt on midweek after the Barcelona game from Dortmund, and he noted how Nemtscher had one of his better games in this game, in the Barcelona game as well. And I think he built on that. I like this front three with Adeyemi, Bayer, and Guirassy a lot. I also thought they had the best moments this year, Dortmund, when Adeyemi and Bayer played on their own up front as well. Obviously, Bayer had to come off really early for Kani, who once again I thought he looks like a player. This is a player. There's some conflicting reports about how much his exit clause, his buy purchase or purchase option is. I've heard 35 million euros. I think The Athletic, Sepp Stafford Bloor reported 50 million euros. the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, to be honest with you, right? Because you always get conflicting reports, and I'm not saying that Sepp's reporting isn't right. And quite the contrary. If he reports something, it's usually watertight. But I think Dortmund have spent that kind of money on worse players in the past. And so, even 50 million euros for Carney feels like a lot, especially, I do think they will make European football, but if they don't make the Champions League, right, it does sound and feel like a lot, but the way he could develop, I think they'll get that back pretty quick. In a world where Bino Gittins can be sold for 60 million euros, can you imagine what Carney would be worth in a few years? And like, once again, today's match underlined that to me, that he's a player that they should bank on, that they should integrate in the side early. And I actually think that this starting 11, that is what Dortmund can build on in the future. There's maybe some players like Benzebain and Süle that you want to maybe, I'm not 100% sure that's your future, but 9 out of 11 position in that starting 11, I would say that is probably maybe the team that you want to build on for the future and then add, right? You can sell probably Bino Gittins, who didn't even come on. Giovanni Reina is another one who like sat on the bench for the full 90 minutes. Duranville is a player. I thought he was excellent when he came on against Barcelona, right? He made things happening. So he's someone you can count on. But you are starting to see contours of a team that Niko Kovac wants to work with. And I think that is really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Chukwuemeka thing is really interesting because he's done so well in the last kind of couple of weeks for Dortmund, but it still is only a handful of games. And, if it does end up being something like 50 million euros, it's a lot of money for a club like Dortmund. And I do kind of wonder if they'll still be a little apprehensive of spending that amount of money on a player
I think
like that.
Sepp's report also stated that Chelsea are open to negotiate.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. And well, what I was going to suggest is I wouldn't be surprised if Dortmund actually maybe asked them to do another kind of loan fee or another loan deal perhaps, and then with another set fee in there. And you can understand them saying, look, we only picked him up in January, if I'm not mistaken. He's only just got into the team. But, he's only going to have, another 4 games left to prove himself, to say if he's worth, as you say, potentially 30, 40 million euros. And as you said, Chelsea don't have any inclination to play him. I was reading Enzo Maresca, the Chelsea head coach. I was reading his quotes today after their game, and this is a team that can't even really find a space for Christopher Nkunku in their squad. And he was asked about Nkunku not being in his team, and he just said, "Oh well, it's due to a technical reason, and the technical reason is they've got a shitload of footballers and they can't fit them all on their bench." So, if they can't even squeeze a guy like Nkunku on the bench, then you can totally understand why Chelsea be like, who? Chukwuemeka? Yeah, do what you want with him next season. We don't really care. Take him on loan again, fine, whatever. Just get him off our wage bill. I can completely see a scenario where Dortmund do come to some sort of understanding with Chelsea, and it's like, yeah, we'll play a set, give us to him for another season, and then we'll pay that 40 or 45 million euros that you're looking for, sort of thing. And maybe they add like a kind of fee up front for it, sort of thing. I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that happens with Chukwuemeka, because I think he's done tremendously well. I think he's a player who could be embedded into Kovac's team very easily next season. And he has, not only has he proved to do very well for Dortmund, but he's actually kind of gone on to be almost like a match winner in a lot of the games he has played well in. So he's kind of already kind of promoting himself to that kind of role of being not only a first team starter, but also an integral part of the way that team plays. And I think he could become even more important next season if Julian Brandt is sold, because, if they do sell Julian Brandt, which seems more and more likely, and I think should be the case because he has kind of plateaued at Dortmund, then I think Chukwuemeka could be the perfect kind of replacement for him in that kind of number 10 position, which is more or less where he played today when he came on against Gladbach. So he could be the solution to that Brandt replacement. He could be the solution to their problems in midfield. I think Nemcha plays much better with him alongside him. I think Gross does as well. In this game alone, Brandt came on the second half, and I was astounded at how many passes he misplaced when he came on, constantly giving the ball away. So I think at this stage in his career, Chukwuemeka is a better player than Brandt, and he could be a perfect replacement. I guess we'll just have to wait and see whether Dortmund are willing to kind of fork out for him, or if they'll say, give us another season, we'll take him on loan, then we'll pay the 40 or 50 million euros you're looking for, because he could be a really, really smart signing for them this summer.
Yeah, I think so too. It's going to be interesting to see like where Dortmund going to end up. I think a lot of that will determine it too. I mean, it is a crazy world now where after all that, if they still finish top four, um, and I'm not sure there would ever been a more undeserved Champions League starter. But I mean, I make this argument all the time in the Substack chat as much as I love the Freiburg and Mainz story. I'm not sure it would be good for them or the Bundesliga if either one of them sneaks into the Champions League. I think the teams in the top right now, and whether it's like the top four right as it is right now with Frankfurt and Leipzig behind Bayern and Leverkusen, or if somehow Dortmund sneaks in there over Leipzig. I think these are teams with a better track record. And like, I know someone said to me, oh, Leipzig like went out, crashed out of the Champions League this year. That's true. But over the last 5 years, they've also reached the semifinals of European competitions twice. They went into the season as a top 10 team in Europe as of the UEFA coefficient standing. So I would actually say this is more of a blip rather than the standard for them if they make it back into Europe. And I'm just looking at, the clubs that represented Germany this year and the results that we had. I think for the league standing overall, it'd be better if more established clubs would make it back in. And I know that's not romantic and it's not great and it doesn't serve Freiburg and Mainz fans. And I know that if they make it in by merit, then that's fine. I'm just warning of the dangers that come with that, Stefan.
Yeah, especially when we consider the fact that Dortmund seem to save their best performance every season for the Champions League, and they seem to be these kind of giant killers season on season. So obviously, it's better for the Bundesliga if Dortmund do get in. It actually kind of reminds me a bit of the situation in Scotland, where when Rangers got relegated to the third division, all these people were saying, "Oh, isn't it fantastic that we can now have these other clubs have a go at it? Your Aberdeens, your St Johnstones, your Hearts, your Hibs, and stuff." And while obviously those clubs all deserve to have their shot in European football, the problem with having minnows represent your league every single season and underperform is that eventually, completely mucks up the club or the country's coefficients. And that's what happened with Scotland, where basically Celtic were more or less the only team doing a great job. Well, not a great job, but by any means, the only club contributing to Celtic's coefficients, and Celtic weren't even doing a particularly great job of it. So it wasn't until really Rangers returned that Scotland were able to kind of get back on an even keel with countries that equal size of them. And, that's kind of the issue. So it's not really a big deal, obviously, if Heidenheim don't do tremendously well in the Conference League or if Hoffenheim don't get to a Europa League final. These clubs deserve to be where they are. But yeah, you're right. In the grand scheme of things, where there's so much money involved and there's so much kind of tussling from one league to the next, then you do kind of need your best clubs and your biggest clubs and your best built squads competing in Europe every year. And, I guess that's what you would hope for with Dortmund. And of course, Dortmund are a staple of the Champions League. They know what the stadium is, their fans are. They were finalists last season, for goodness sake. So yeah, while I wouldn't say, as I agree with you, I wouldn't say they have a God-given right to finish fourth. It would be probably quite reassuring for the people at the Bundesliga offices in Cologne or Frankfurt if they did, because I think it would probably make their jobs next season a lot easier.
I mean, even if they're in the Europa League, I think they'd be automatic one of the favorites to win it. And that is massive for your coefficient standings. That's massive, because it doesn't differentiate between Europa League and Champions League, right? So, and if you, for example, have a top four the way it is right now with Dortmund in the Europa League and Stuttgart winning the Pokal and being in the Europa League as well, I think the Bundesliga DFL head offices in Frankfurt are going to be quite happy about that. And that is not to take away from the Gladbachs of this world or Bremen, who are also still pushing, but it's just something I wanted to point out.